Hi, and welcome to another edition of What on Earth, your fortnightly news capsule that covers the most important events that keep our world spinning. We start off in the USA, where the president's first public impeachment hearings happened last week in a continuing saga that rivals Deadpool. For the number of times he's been sliced, diced, shredded, and burnt, he's still there. The president has been accused of using his public office for personal gain, and enough evidence has been unearthed from records of his phone calls with the Ukrainian president to start the impeachment process. The Cheeto King has gone from being completely and totally uninterested in the whole affair while hosting Bestie Erdogan to denying that he's been scaring off witnesses on Twitter, saying that he's just been exercising his right to free speech. The impeachment hearings will continue next week. And right after that will be the president's chance to defend himself against accusations. I'll be whipping out my popcorn when this drama starts. The pathological liar that he is, Mr. Trump will be telling his first lie under oath when he swears to tell the truth. But there's still a lot that has to go down for an impeachment, with the Senate controlled by the Republicans being the biggest obstacle. Evo Morales, the indigenous president of Bolivia, decided to step down after 14 years of leading the country when the chief of his armed forces suggested that he leave following widespread protests after a sketchy election victory on October 20th. Evo's decision on November 10th was followed by a quick run-up to Mexico where he was granted political asylum. Janine Anez, a political foe of Mr. Morales, declared herself as Bolivia's interim president and said that she'll hold fresh elections. Looks like it's now time for Bolivia to evolve. Alibaba Singles Day on November 11th broke its own records again. The 11th edition of the annual online shopping festival, created as an anti-Valentine's Day event in China, raked in $38 billion in revenue in a single day, smashing last year's record of $31 billion. Taylor Swift shook things off for the day with a performance that included hits from her latest album. And that got the cash registers ringing, as nothing, the Hong Kong protests or trade tensions with the USA or a slowing economy, could come between Chinese shoppers and the goodies on offer online. And now we'll sit back and wait for a tsunami of cardboards and plastic from the packaging to hit the world. Venice was hit by its worst floods for half a century, as heavy rain and strong winds pushed a really high tide through the flood walls in the city. Venice is built on a series of small islands in a shallow lagoon and has slowly been sinking, a situation made worse by rising sea levels as a result of climate change. The latest flooding is the highest recorded in the city since 1966. Water entered the world-famous St. Mark's Cathedral, forcing authorities to close the iconic tourist spot. All modes of transportation, the gondola and the vaporetti, were shut down. Seems pretty weird considering that both primarily operate on water. India's Supreme Court delivered their verdict on a long contested dispute in the Indian city of Ayodhya. The dispute began in 1992 when a mosque in the city was destroyed by Hindu mobs who claimed that the area under the mosque was the birthplace of the Hindu god Rama. 27 years for a verdict? That's almost 2 full lifetimes for us people. The Indian court acknowledged that the destruction of the mosque was illegal, but they decided to allow the Hindus to construct their own temple over the plot of land. In turn, the court also provided land for a new mosque to be built. That's like having a bully take away $10 from a small kid and a teacher letting the bully keep the $10 and giving the tiny kid 50 cents out of pity. India's Muslim community, the kid with the 50 cents, has not complained majorly for obvious reasons, but they are thinking of filing a review petition. After being trapped in a rather sticky situation, Greta Thunberg is traveling with Australian YouTubers to the climate conference in Spain. Thunberg was traveling from the United States down to Chile, where the 2019 climate conference APEC was supposed to be held. But Chileans decided to protest against the Santiago metro fare hike and rising inequality in their country. This got out of hand pretty quick, and the climate conference was shifted to Spain. This put Greta in a quandary. She was on her way to Chile, and while she could spin around, she couldn't go to Spain without using unsustainable methods of transportation. something that she has vowed not to do. Couldn't she just have gotten onto Skype or Zoom to address a conference in Spain? Anyway, luck was on her side when she found the Australian YouTuber vloggers sailing on their catamaran to the climate conference in Spain and tagged along with them.
It's time for the moment you've been waiting for.
With Hong Kong being in a state of semi-shutdown the entirety of last week due to the protests, Conrad was holed up in his room, crunching hard on his PP 24/7. He seemed to have a lot of encounters with pesky bugs since he learned that using boiling hot water to kill them is a far more efficient method than traditional toilet paper. Speaking of the unrest in Hong Kong, we now move on to our main topic for today. Today, we're going to look at protests exploding around the world and figure out why exactly they're mushrooming in the first place. From violent outcries for a better government in Chile, Ecuador, Iraq, and Hong Kong, to slightly more peaceful calls for reform in Bolivia, Algeria, and Lebanon, it's becoming increasingly difficult to keep up with the protest movements that have been popping up all over the place in the last few months. It's become hard to place a finger on the causes of these protests. Researchers have been stumped over why things are happening so fast, so often. So stumped that some have even been proposing absurd reasons. One supposedly said that the protests are happening because they can be more exciting than the drudgery of daily life. And when everybody else is doing it, you're bound to be drawn into it as well. Right. 10 years from now, parents will be telling their kids to go outside and protest because it's good fun. And rather than riding bicycles or doing stunts on scooters, teens will be throwing Molotov cocktails around because it's more exciting than the drudgery of daily life. So, I decided to have a look at the opinions of columnists from some very reliable sources: The Economist, The Washington Post, The Guardian, and ABC Australia. I synthesized their views, which gave me 3 points. First, the protests are happening because of economic inequality. Second, government corruption. And third, a lack of political freedom. Let's look at this theory about economics. Rises in transportation fees in Chile, taxes on seemingly arbitrary things like phone calls in Lebanon are supposedly the first reason as to why these protests are fueled, and for a very, very good reason. In economically unstable or unequal societies, these modifications to the way money flows around pushes the most vulnerable, the most disenfranchised members of society into a corner. For these people, they're no longer able to make phone calls. They're no longer able to take the bus to buy groceries. Yes, in countries like the USA, changes to economic policy don't stir up Molotov cocktails being chucked at government buildings. And that's because the vast majority of the populace leads a fairly comfortable life, where an extra dollar to the metro ticket doesn't harm them in any way. But in countries like Lebanon, where 16% of the urban population and 36% of the rural population lives in extreme poverty, these so-called economic reforms of taxing simple things like WhatsApp aren't helping the grassroots of society, and is instead exacerbating the income gap that is seen today. And when these disenfranchised individuals are pushed to the precipice of collapse, that is when they retaliate through the form of protests. Second, on corruption. Claims of government corruption are at the heart of several of the protests, and even these are closely linked to the issue of inequality. Protesters in Lebanon argue that in addition to the major economic crisis that is the tax on WhatsApp, the country's leaders have also been using their positions of power to enrich themselves through the form of bribery and shady deals. People in Iraq have also been calling for the end of a political system that they say has failed them. One of the main points of contention there is the way government appointments are made on the basis of sectarian or ethnic quotas instead of on merit. Demonstrators argue that this has allowed leaders to abuse public funds to reward themselves and their followers with very little benefit to most citizens. And finally, political freedom. In some countries, protesters are angered by political systems in which they feel that they are trapped. Demonstrations in Hong Kong, for example, began this summer over a bill that would have allowed criminal suspects to be extradited to mainland China in certain circumstances. Hong Kong is part of China, but its people enjoy special and certain freedoms, and there is a deep sense of fear that Beijing wants to exert greater control now. Protesters in Hong Kong now fear that the city is becoming a puppet of China and want to change that. Even though the controversial extradition bill has been shelved, protests continue as Hong Kongers vow for increased political freedoms. Among their demands, protesters now want complete universal suffrage, an independent inquiry into alleged police brutality, and amnesty for demonstrators who have been arrested. In Bolivia, our good friend Evo Morales' decision to run for a fourth consecutive term in October angered many voters, especially since he himself had vowed to crack down on politicians taking complete control of power. In a 2016 referendum, a majority had voted no to dropping the limit of term numbers that Bolivians could serve. But Mr. Morales' party took the issue to the Constitutional Court, which abolished the term limits altogether. So, these seem to be the reasons as to why protests around the world are cropping up like pop-up ads for MacKeeper on your laptop. And if we look at the current demonstrations, we can see that all of these trends match up with the movements in one way or another. Here's the worrying bit. None of these trends are likely to change or end anytime soon. People are frustrated faster than ever, and the fact that everyone and their mom is on Facebook, Twitter, and Telegram means that protests are able to spread their message spontaneously. The movements that we're all seeing all over the world aren't going to die down unless demonstrators give up in frustration or governments forcefully put a lid on them. And when the latter happens, it's going to be a tragedy. But for now, this is the new normal. That's all for today. Thank you for tuning into this episode of What on Earth, and I'll see you next week for your news in a nutshell.